Thanks for everyone to participate in the virtual meeting this year. I am going to talk about some of the things we've been doing on fresh market vegetables over the past year, and I'm going to jump right into it. So just want to kind of remind folks about some of the resources that are out there for weeds and weed management, some of the updates that will be coming out in the shortly on our updates, and then a couple of research projects that we've been doing over the last couple of years on weed emergence and post-emergence herbicides for sweet corn. So I think Andy talked a little bit about the Mid-Atlantic commercial vegetable guides. As he mentioned, we are not publishing the full copy every year. This year there will be an abbreviated version of what's been changed since 2020, and then in 2022 we will have a new version. But if you don't have access to this, you need to get it. There's a wealth of information there. Most of the questions we get asked are addressed in the book, and that's why we address them in the book, because people ask us about them and help guide us to what's critical information. So it's in the guide. I will say that this is a resource. It is particularly as it relates to pesticides. You do need to go back to the labels and read the specific labels to make sure there hasn't been any late changes that we weren't aware of or weren't able to get into the guide, but this is critical. Weed ID, having the Weeds of the Northeast is an excellent publication that I highly recommend to anyone working with weeds. Here's a list of a few weed identification guides that are free and online. The Virginia Tech, which has a lot of the common weed species in the area. Ohio puts out a publication online on perennials and biannual weeds. University of Massachusetts, they have the Weed Herbarium, some excellent photographs of well over 300 species with a slight description on all of them. And then the Weed ID from the University of Missouri. And this is actually available as an app on the phone for identification. It's not only a catalog of photographs, but it also serves as it has a key which allows you to kind of narrow down the choices of weeds. Yeah, and they too have over 300 species in their database. So if you don't have those, by all means, get access to them. As far as the guide for this year and some of the updates since it was published last, we don't have a lot. The two, I guess, of note as it relates to herbicides, Sonlan now has a label for use in tomatoes. Sonlan is a group 3 herbicide, very similar to Dual. It has a very favorable rotational profile. Anyone, well, you know, in this audience, a lot of you are using Curbit in your vine crops. The active ingredient in Sonlan and Curbit are the same. So I'll give you an idea of the spectrum of control you might expect. The Sonlan needs to be incorporated within 2 to 3 days of application, and that incorporation can either be through irrigation or mechanically. We have a little bit more details in the update on the regional recommendation guides coming out. The other change of note is the select max rate that is in the guide is listed as 12 to 16 ounces, and it should have been 9 to 16 ounces. So just a minor note there. Many of you are aware of paraquat is now have additional restrictions on its use, primarily the way that the packaging is handled, and this, as well as anyone who's handling it or using it, required to take trainings. This is not for any specific formulation of paraquat. It's for all the different formulations out there, whether it's the Syngenta brand or Helena or any of them out there. It's for all the paraquat formulations. So it's been a restricted use pesticide, so that has not changed. But what has changed is that even though you can purchase it with that restricted use pesticide license, you need to have additional application training. And this is anyone who's involved with mixing or loading, applying, transporting, or disposing of the product or the containers. The training is valid for 3 years, so it doesn't have to be done every year. So if you did it in past year, you're fine for 2 more. The training is available online and through extension on the URL is here at the bottom. So be sure if you haven't had this training and you're considering using paraquat this year, that you get the training. So one of the things with the paraquat is that all has to come through a closed system, and that is true whether you're buying it in bulk or in smaller containers. So any new purchases will be within this closed system. Different companies have different systems, so be sure that you check that out beforehand, depending on what brand you're buying. But if you have some of the old products still either in the warehouse or in your chemical shed, you're still allowed to use them as long as you still have the label and the label is valid. And you're able to use it until the stocks run out. So just want to mention that we've done a few trials in vegetables that are very preliminary. I often get asked about what we're doing as far as weeds, or what can we talk about. Unfortunately, a lot of what we do is very early in the developmental stage, and it may be a couple of years before it gets registered. Working with some of these products, they never get registered because of crop safety and other issues. But just to kind of let you know some of the things that we did this past year in 2020, we were looking at an experimental herbicide for use on cole crops. Looks somewhat promising. In fact, this product could also had some safety in peas, but it's not yet registered in the U.S. So we hope that it continues to move forward. Working with the IR4 project, for those of you who are not familiar with IR4, it's a USDA-funded project that helps with the registration of pesticides on specialty. IR4 works with the basic manufacturers about doing the testing and modifying labels so that they could be used in the future with vegetables. So we've been working with IR4 for a while now. We've been looking at some products for peppers and tomatoes as row middle treatments. Still pretty early in that process, but just be aware that we are looking at some options there. And then with Penn State, we were looking at some options for reduced or no-till vegetable production. So we have a fair number of projects going on. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not at the point yet that we can really talk in great detail about them. All right, kind of shifting gears here about some of the projects in the last year so that we can talk about. And we've been looking at some weed emergence over the last couple of years. A lot of times get asked about why didn't the herbicides work? Why do we have some of these late late emergence of weeds in the field? Particularly when folks are talking about 2 or 3 different farms or different portions of the field. It worked in one side but not in the other. Obviously it comes back to the herbicide. Why didn't that herbicide work? But in many times, it's really we need to focus on what weeds are involved and why didn't what's going on within that biology and ecology of the weed that allows it to escape control or not to be as effectively controlled. And a lot of that comes back to emergence and emergence timing for some of our species. So we started about 3 years ago, looking at about 12 different common weed species in the area. We seeded them in small plots and go out on a regular basis every week to 10 days and count emergence and to get a better handle on where our emergence is occurring for some of these species. And so this is an average over 3 years of some of our common species, looking at from 0 up to 100% emergence. At what did emergence stop? And we started this in early to mid-April, and we continued it to mid to late August. And again, going out on a weekly basis, counting these seedlings. And you know, I guess as kind of a starting point from a weed control standpoint, we kind of used 80% as what is our emergence. Okay, when did 80%, at what point in the season did 80% of the giant foxtail or the lamb's quarter emerge? So if we want to look at our two of our common grass species, giant foxtail and large crabgrass, at what point did we see 80% emergence for them? Yeah, with the giant foxtail, it was about the third week of May, at which point we've seen about 80% of the weeds emerge. Now, I will say we did tillage in mid-April on these plots, conventional. We went back, so we caused the disturbance, but that was our only disturbance in the field. So so again, third week of May for 80% emergence on the giant foxtail. Crabgrass, it was about an additional 2 weeks before we reached that 80% emergence. So one of the reasons why we see more problems, I think, with large crabgrass than we do with giant foxtail is that it's germinating over a longer period of time. And so particularly for some of our early planted crops, we need something, we need some weed control strategies that are going to provide us an extended period of control when the field is infested with crabgrass compared to giant foxtail. Looking at two of our broadleaf weeds, this is our smooth or redroot pigweed, not palmer, but smooth or redroot pigweed and common lamb's quarter. And again, where did we see about 80% emergence with these two species? Well, with the large crabgrass, about 80% of our large crabgrass, common lamb's quarter, about 80% of our common lamb's quarter had emerged by about the third, fourth week of May. It kind of bears out, we think of it as an early emerging species, and it certainly is. You can see that when we started our counts back in mid-April, at least that's when we started our graph, we about 35% of the common lamb's quarter had already emerged. And then that compared to the redroot or the smooth pigweed, 80% emergence, we didn't see that till almost the third week in June. So we have a much longer germination period with our with our smooth pigweed than we do with common lamb's quarter. So how does this kind of fit into our management thoughts or weed control strategies? So if we're looking at, particularly with a pre-emergence herbicide, we're planting a crop, say late April, and we know that our herbicide is going to give us about 4 to 5 weeks of residual control, depending on the product, depending on irrigation, a lot of things. But let's just say 4 weeks of residual control. So if we put it out there, late April, 4 weeks of residual control, something like our common lamb's quarter by the time that herbicide starts breaking down, we have pretty much gone beyond the emergence period of common lamb's quarter, and we're not going to have much of an issue with common lamb's quarter after that point. On the other hand, the smooth pigweed, by the time that product is breaking down, it's reached about 50% emergence, and we're not going to reach 80% emergence until mid-June. So we need something that's going to help provide control or suppression of that common lamb's quarter for an additional 3 weeks once that product breaks down. Now, if we have a crop canopy to do that, that's great. But if we have some of our more open crops, like some of our vegetables, we are going to need to supplement that with either a post-emergence herbicide spray or cultivation or some other tactic that's going to help carry us through. So, looking at some of the old standbys here as far as our weed species, the two grass species, giant foxtail, large crabgrass, lamb's quarter, smooth pigweed, so how does that compare to the new one on the block, this Palmer Amaranth? That's what we're seeing here in our line, our orange line here. The Palmer Amaranth has a much longer period of germination. It may start a little bit later than some of these others. We didn't really start to see much emergence of Palmer Amaranth until April, but we didn't reach 80% emergence of Palmer Amaranth until July 9th over a 3-year period. So really does kind of stretch out weed control strategies and the time that we need to be on the lookout for Palmer Amaranth. So just one of those bits of information that, herbicides, we often, when we think about herbicides or weed control, we focus strictly on herbicides or maybe our control tactic. And we need to think more also about the ecology of weeds that we're trying to control and how that fits into our weed control strategies. So wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about some sweet corn, some of the work we've done in the last couple of years in sweet corn. We've got a number of herbicides labeled for sweet corn. Yeah, I think in our recommendation guide, we have more products labeled for sweet corn than we do, I think, any other crop. We have a number of products both from a soil applied standpoint as well as post-emergence. And again, a lot of our soil applied herbicides are prepackaged mixes of multiple active ingredients. The bicep is the dual plus atrazine, compared to the Acheron, which has got 4 active ingredients, the dual callisto, bicyclopyrone, as well as atrazine. So, we do have a number of commercially available products, but if you look at it in terms of active ingredients and herbicide chemistry, it may not be quite as extensive as we think of. So a lot of these products on the left, atrazine and prowl, we have the dual magnum, but remember the dual magnum plus atrazine is bicep, outlook, harness extra. So again, if we think about it in terms of herbicide chemistry, we have maybe not as extensive as we think of. So, atrazine is a group 5 herbicide. Prowl is the group 3, which is the only product in this list that has this group. But most of these other products have a lot of group 15 herbicides or group 27s. So just being aware that that even though they're herbicide families, they all have some unique niches for control. So need to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of these individual products and which one best fits your scenario. When it comes to herbicide programs, particularly for sweet corn, but with most of them, and I say particularly for sweet corn because we have a lot of post-emergence options, our most consistent programs year after year across fields is being a 2-pass program with a pre-emergence application followed by a post-emergence application. They have been the most consistent. They're better suited for variable weather patterns. It helps with some of these late emerging weeds like we were talking about. And so they have performed most consistent for us. And along with that better performance is the reducing the amount of seed production that's occurring and limiting the number of seeds going back into the seed bank. The performance, particularly with our post-emergence programs, is really based on timing, and with that post-emergence application going out on small weeds. And by small weeds, 3 to 4 inches is what we're focusing on. By using a pre followed by a post, it allows us to use some additional herbicide sites of action and diversify our herbicide programs. And if we go into it with the strategy that we are going to use a pre followed by post or sequential applications, that it allows us to modify what we might be using pre. So if we know we're going to come in and use a post herbicide, say an HPPD herbicide like Callisto or Laudis or Armazon, it allows us to maybe back off on what we're putting into our pre-programs. So when it comes to post-emergence options for sweet corn, this is our list of what we have available. Those on the left are some of those that are a little bit broader spectrum of control. Many of them provide at least some early season or some residual control. Most of them have very good to very good crop safety, but because they provide some residual control, they also have issues with rotational problems. The ones on the right, Basque Grant, AIM, Cadet, Star Rain, they allow more rotational flexibility, but they also tend to have a much narrower spectrum of control. So because there's been an increase in the last few years on some of the labeling for HPPD herbicides, we started a trial last year looking at all of these products compared to side by side. Because while they're all very similar, they're all group 27 herbicides, there are some unique differences for them. For instance, if you think about it in terms of the pre-harvest intervals between these products, it ranges from 45 days to Laudis, which doesn't necessarily specify on their labels. It gives you a little bit more flexibility on when that's being applied. They vary in what they require or recommend for additives. Callisto and sweet corn label recommends use of non-ox surfactant, all the way down to Shieldex, which label they prefer methylated seed oil, but you could also use crop oil or non-ox surfactant plus a nitrogen source on Shieldex. These products also vary in their length of carryover and their rotational restrictions. For instance, snap beans varies from 9 to 10 months, not a huge amount, but there is a little bit of difference there depending on when your sweet corn's planted and what your snap bean rotation is. But when it comes to cabbage and watermelons, Shieldex, this one at the bottom, is 9 months to these crops, whereas all the others are 18. So just to kind of highlight some of the differences between these products, and we need to, when we're in vegetable production, we need to think about it more than just efficacy, but also in terms of rotation. And so, with Shieldex being kind of a new one on the market, we haven't had a whole lot of experience with it. We did a trial the last 2 years looking at these 4 products and their utility in sweet corn. We've seen pretty good crop safety with all of these. There are some sweet corn varieties out there that can cause that are sensitive to some of these. As a general rule, I think Callisto we see a little bit more injury than we do with the other 3. Most of the sweet corn varieties that we grow in the area, though, are quite tolerant to all 4 of these herbicides. But if you're going in with a new hybrid or or an unusual one, you might want to test beforehand or ask around to make sure there is some good crop safety with that one. But for the impact in Amazon, we did a trial a number of years ago looking at about 50 different hybrids across multiple states, and we were seeing excellent crop safety with this chemistry. So in this particular trial, we were looking at the 4 HPPD inhibiting herbicides. We applied them at the 1x, the 2x rates, and then the 1x rate plus atrazine. So we had Palmer Amaranth in this trial, and so we've got the 4 herbicides on the left: Callisto, Impact, or Armazon, Loudest, and Shieldex. The blue bar is at the 1x rate, the yellow bar at the 2x rate, and the green bar is the 1x rate plus atrazine. So we just kind of want to focus on the blue bars. By themselves, the Impact, Loudest, and Shieldex were giving us better Palmer Amaranth control than the Callisto. But once we added atrazine to any one of these, we were at about 93% control or higher. Really no clear winner in that race once you add the atrazine to it. But it does, again, it also emphasizes the importance of including atrazine with these products. And in this particular case, we were using a pint of atrazine. Looking at fall panicum, let me go back and the Callisto. I do want to kind of point out that that low with Callisto by itself did not perform as well as the others. Remember, with Callisto and sweet corn, the label requires the use of a non-IX surfactant. When we're using Callisto in field corn, we are using it oftentimes with nitrogen and in some cases crop oil, which would improve that control. But again, adding the atrazine really brought it up to where it's performing similar to the other products. Fall panicum, we really, the Impact in the Armazon was the winner here in terms of its performance, either at the 1x rate or with atrazine. Again, although I must say it was not outstanding, we got about 72-73% control with the atrazine rate. The Loudest, while it does do a pretty good job on most of our grasses, fall panicum is its Achilles heel, and it won't control fall panicum as we see here. So is not generally considered as good as some of these other products when it comes to grass control. In this particular trial, we used the Impact in Armazon at the 3/4 ounce rate. The label allows up to a 1 ounce rate, particularly where there are grasses. So we could have used a higher rate, probably, and I know we would have, because of other work, our fall panicum control would have been slightly better. But we went with the 3/4x rate in this particular trial because of its keeping it consistent with the other products. But for grass control, we can go with higher rates of those products. After this, we harvested the corn, we mowed it down, we let the corn set stalks and leaves dry down a little bit, and then we drilled cover crops because we wanted to see how well these cover crops would tolerate these herbicides. And so in 2019, we hairy vetch, forage, or tillage radish over the right through the crop without tilling. And in 2020, we drilled crimson clover, again, forage radish or tillage radish, and cereal rye through the plots. In 2019, we saw no treatment differences for any of the herbicides, even at a 2x rate. And the most injury we saw with anything was about 6%. And 6% is not something that you're going to see in a field unless you have an untreated check right next to it. So really no treatment differences observed in 2019. in 2020. We've rated it twice now. I think the last time I rated it was early December. And while statistically we saw some differences out there, there was nothing that caused more than 7% injury. Really nothing to be of concern as far as cover crops, planting behind these 4 HPPD herbicides for sweet corn. So just to kind of wrap it up here, when we're thinking about post-emergence applications, a lot of the company literature that we hear about talks about the window of application and how late you can make that application in terms of crop safety. And while that's important, what we really need to focus on is the weed size and when those applications ought to be made based on spraying small and susceptible weeds. Also, be aware that for some products, the application window in terms of crop stage doesn't necessarily match up with our pre-harvest intervals, though. So we need to keep both those factors in mind when we're deciding on what and when to spray post-emergence herbicides in sweet corn. So get the appropriate resources that you might not have ready access to, whether it's a weed identification bookmark those websites so they're readily available. It's much easier to do that now sitting in the office than in kind of in the heat of the summer and trying to find time even to do a little bit of web search. Find those now, bookmark them so you have them available. If you don't have the vegetable recommendation guide, be sure to do so. Download the updates for 2021. Think about your troublesome species that you're dealing with, and let's not focus strictly on what chemical options are there, but let's focus on the ecology and biology of those species and where do we have target or maybe areas that we can target for control. And again, if you're looking for a more consistent program for sweet corn, as well as most of our crops, thinking about a pre-fall by post is the best option. So, Gordon, if I have any time, I'll have some questions. Otherwise, I'll keep an eye on the chat and answer questions that might be in the chat box.